So in the last lecture, we looked at the anatomy of the heart itself. Now we're going to take a look at the anatomy of the blood vessels. We'll start with kind of a general overview of different types of blood vessels and anatomically how they're different, how their tissue's different, and how that kind of creates a different function for them. And then we'll look specifically at the names and the distribution of arteries and veins throughout the body. So first, just a general look at blood vessels, and probably some of this is familiar to you from previous teaching on the cardiovascular system, but arteries, I mentioned in the last lecture, are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and veins are vessels that carry blood to the heart. Capillaries would be the blood vessels that you really can't categorize them as arteries or veins. They're the blood vessels that allow for the exchange of material from the arteries out to the tissue, and then the exchange of waste from the tissue back into the veins and carried back to the heart and other parts of the body. So the capillaries really are their own category. Then we have kind of subcategories of arteries and veins, and we'll talk about a few of these as we go along. Right here, we'll just mention arterioles. These are smaller arteries that are highly muscular. Nearly their entire wall is composed of muscle, and that's important because they can constrict or dilate and help change blood flow. We'll see that here in a minute. But basically, you go from artery down to arteriole, then to capillary, and then we're going to head back up toward vein, right? So next would be a venule, would be a small vein that the capillary connects to, and then you would finally end up with your larger veins. So that's kind of how the blood flows from the heart. It goes to arteries, then arterioles, capillaries where the exchange of material happens, and then the used up blood goes to the venules and then to the veins. Okay, so blood vessels, typically we're going to see most blood vessels, not capillaries, but most of the other blood vessels are going to be composed of generally 3 layers. And we're going to look at these from the outside in. So the outside most layer is called the adventitia. Another name is the tunica externa. So you'll see there's kind of 2 ways of naming these layers of the blood vessels. You can use the word tunica, and then you can talk about the external, the one in the middle, and the one inside, externa, media, and intima. Or, more commonly, we call this outer layer the adventitia. And the adventitia is basically just a layer of connective tissue that helps to keep the blood vessel anchored in its surrounding tissue. And you guys, if you pay attention when you're doing your dissections of the fetal pig, which will be here in a few weeks, you'll see that you'll have some blood vessels running throughout the body. And pay attention, you'll notice that they're not really free floating. They're kind of attached to connective tissue in that area, so that they're allowed to move. They're flexible, they're mobile, but they're not completely free. They're actually connected to the surrounding tissue, and that's important just to keep them in place and to protect them. Okay, if we go down in through the next layer, so adventitia would be the outer layer, then the middle layer we call media, or the tunica media, and that contains largely muscle. And that muscle is important on the arterial side to kind of help give some stiffness to the arteries, as well as to help the arteries constrict or dilate based on whether that muscle is contracting or relaxing. When it relaxes, the blood vessel dilates, and when it contracts, the blood vessel gets smaller or constricts. And that's going to change blood flow and, as a result, blood pressure. And we'll talk about that more when we get to physiology. The intima, that's the inner layer, as the name would suggest. That's composed of what we call endothelium. So endothelium is just a type of squamous epithelium, if you remember from our early lectures on the different tissue types. So endothelial tissue is a epithelial tissue, and it's kind of a very thin, flat, squamous type epithelial tissue. And this layer is typically only one layer, which is important for later on when we get to the capillaries. You're going to have only that endothelial layer and just a tiny bit of connective tissue, so that things can diffuse easily in and out of the capillaries. So you have the outer layer, the adventitia, that's connective tissue, serves as an anchor. The media is the middle layer, that's muscle, can constrict or dilate. And then the intima is the endothelial epithelial tissue, that kind of is what the blood cells and the blood is in contact with on the inner surface of the blood vessels. All right, so let's start by looking at how these blood vessels, so I mentioned arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. We're going to look at how they're different. So they're all composed of those three layers, except for capillaries, we'll see. But there's different amounts of connective tissue versus muscle in the different types of blood vessels, and that helps serve the purpose of those blood vessels. So we'll see that as we go along. So let's start with the arteries, and we'll start with the large arteries, and we call these large arteries, we call them elastic arteries, and that's because they have a bit more elastic connective tissue than some of the other blood vessels. And we're talking here about big arteries like the aorta, for example, or the branches that come immediately off of the aorta, like the subclavian, for example. These are large arteries, and they're quite elastic, and that's a good design, because we want those early blood vessels, well, we want them to be big because they have to carry large amounts of blood. And you'll learn in physiology that the ability for blood to flow, or the ease of flow of the blood, is largely determined by the radius of the tube, the radius of the artery. So a larger artery allows for an easier blood flow. So we want these early arteries coming off the heart, like the aorta, and the early arteries coming off the aorta, like the subclavians, and maybe even the common carotid. We want them to be large, but we also want them to be stretchable. We want them to be distensible. So we want them to be able to absorb some of the pressure that is coming from the contraction of the heart. Because they are so close to the source, so close to the pump, they have to be able to withstand all of that pressure as the left ventricle contracts and pushes the blood forcefully out through the aorta. The aorta and those early blood vessels, they have to be able to absorb that high pressure because they're so close to the pump, so close to the source. And that is done by having increased amounts of elastic tissue in the wall of these arteries. And so what happens as let's say this is the aorta, and as the blood comes through the aorta, what happens is the aorta is able to, in a sense, distend a little bit, kind of absorb some of that pressure by expanding slightly. And it's going to actually hold that extra pressure until diastole. Remember, systole is when there's contraction happening. So if we talk about ventricular systole, that's when the left ventricle and the right ventricle are contracting. So during ventricular systole, you get some mild distension of these large blood vessels, like I've shown here in the picture. And then during diastole, when the ventricles are at rest and the pressure begins to drop, the walls are elastic, and they push back inward, and they actually increase the pressure inside the arteries in order to help blood continue to flow even when the ventricles are relaxing. And we'll talk more about that in physiology. But right now I just want you to understand that these large blood vessels are highly elastic, kind of springy, so they're able to distend during ventricular contraction, and then they're able to kind of rebound during diastole. And that helps to stabilize the blood pressure. All right, so as we move away from the aorta and those first branches, and we start getting to kind of, medium-sized arteries. So these are still arteries, maybe the brachial artery, for example, or radial or ulnar artery as we get further down in the arm. These are still larger arteries, but not as large as the big ones. And so these ones are going to start to have a bit more muscle than the elastic ones had. And these arteries can constrict and kind of help to direct the blood flow to different parts of the body. So what we're seeing here is kind of an in-between. We've got those large elastic arteries, and we're about to see arterioles, which are almost all muscle. So the arteries in between are not as elastic as the large vessels, and they're not quite as muscular as arterioles. They're kind of in between. So we'll see here now with arterioles, this is almost all muscle. I mean, they're the smallest of the arteries, but they're completely composed of muscle. And because of that, they are really most important in helping to direct the flow of blood through a part of tissue. So let's say we have a blood vessel coming here, and we've got some cells, some tissue here. And let's say that this tissue on the left is inactive. It's not really producing much. It's kind of quiet. But there's tissue over here on this side, and let's say this tissue here is quite active. So we'll call this active tissue. So there's only so much blood in the body to go around. So as the blood comes through this larger artery, it's going to branch off by arterioles into surrounding tissue. Well, as I mentioned, there's only so much blood here. So what will happen is these arterioles that are going to the inactive tissue will constrict. And that constriction will actually cause the blood, because the blood is going to go to the pathway of least resistance. And so it's going to bypass the arterioles that are constricted, and it's going to flow through arterioles that are more open. And what that does is it allows the body to deliver blood to tissues that need it more, to tissues that are active, and maybe to deliver less blood to tissues that are inactive. And the arterioles play a big part in directing that blood flow. They also have a big effect on blood pressure, because pressure is determined by resistance, and resistance is determined by the diameter of the tube. So if my tube is that big at rest and then it constricts down to that size, that's going to effectively double my blood pressure. And so we're going to see in physiology that arterioles are the blood vessel that's really most effective for controlling blood pressure. All right, so we went from large arteries to medium arteries to arterioles, which are the smallest arteries, and eventually we're going to get to capillaries, right? And this is where exchange of material happens. We get rid of the good stuff to the tissue, and we take away all of the waste product from the tissue so that it can be disposed of. Well, capillaries do not have these three layers, the adventitia and the media and the intima, like the other blood vessels do. The capillaries basically have a one-layer thin epithelium that we call endothelial tissue, and then just a tiny bit of connective tissue to kind of anchor it in place and hold it together, that we call the basal lamina. So, and this is, of course, a great design as well, because we want to have as little of a barrier as possible for the exchange of material. So we want very thin cells, hence the squamous epithelial cells, and we really don't want all of that muscle and connective tissue getting in the way of diffusion. So this very thin wall of the capillaries allows for faster diffusion of gases as well as nutrients and wastes. And capillaries themselves are very, very small. In fact, sometimes they're only the size of a red blood cell, which makes it difficult sometimes in the very small capillaries for cells to move through, and they have to kind of march through one by one. So capillaries are very small and very thin, and that's great for their function, which is diffusion and the exchange of materials. Just to kind of zoom in a little bit on how it is that materials can move in and out of capillaries. I mean, on the one hand, you've got a very thin squamous epithelial. So let's say I have a gas in here like oxygen. Oxygen is small enough that it can diffuse across the plasma membrane, and it can diffuse into the surrounding tissue. And because that wall is so thin, it's able to diffuse quickly. However, let's say we have larger materials that need to pass through from the blood supply into the surrounding tissue, and it's too large to diffuse across that cell membrane barrier. What the capillary also has is kind of like pores or slits in between adjacent epithelial cells, adjacent endothelial cells, and so these other materials can sometimes squeeze through those gaps and make it into the surrounding tissue. And you can see here, sometimes there's pores or fenestrations that will allow material to leak out of the capillaries. So their anatomical design fits their function well. Okay, so once you have the exchange at the capillary bed, now it's time for that used up blood to be carried back to the heart. And so that's going to happen through the vein side. So the smallest of the veins are called venules. There's very little muscle there in these blood vessels. It's mostly connective tissue. As we go up from the venules, we get medium-sized veins. Now we're going to start to see again all three of those layers that we mentioned, the adventitia, the media, and the intima. In this case, the adventitia is still the largest layer, that connective tissue layer. So there's a lot of collagen and elastic tissue there. And we start to get one-way valves, and these valves are going to be important for kind of directing blood flow back to the heart. We'll see here in a picture. But these valves begin in these medium-sized veins. So the venous side of our circulation is low pressure because as the blood moves through your body, it encounters friction against the walls of your blood vessels, and as it encounters that friction, the pressure begins to drop. So by time we get on the other side of capillaries, the pressure is quite low. So we have to have some tricks to get the blood to go from the veins, let's say in your legs or in your abdomen, all the way up your body and into your chest and into your heart. If you think about the venous blood that's on the top side of your body, from your head, your neck, your arms, typically when you're standing, gravity will pull that blood down, and so that's not so difficult to get back to your heart. But think about standing for a prolonged period. How do you get the blood, the low pressure venous blood that's in your feet and ankles and legs, how do you get that all the way up to the heart? And so there's a couple of mechanisms that the body uses. One of them is the use of these valves in these medium-sized veins. So one of the ways that the body creates pressure, in order to pump that blood back up to the heart is by muscle contraction. So if we're looking at a vein, for example, in the posterior part of the leg, and you can see that when the muscle's relaxed, the vein is open and there's really no extra pressure there. But once you contract the muscle, that squeezes the blood, in a sense kind of squeezes the blood up from wherever the contraction was. It acts as a pump to squeeze. Well, when the muscle relaxes again, that blood, because of gravity, would want to fall back down and go back down into the legs. And that's what these valves are for. So the blood goes kind of up towards the heart during muscle contraction, and then as it would try to come back down, those valves close and it prevents the blood from leaking back down into the legs. So those one-way valves are important for making sure, especially in the lower limbs, that blood can get back to the heart. Okay, larger veins, these are going to be veins like the superior and inferior vena cava, and some of the larger veins that feed into that. There's going to be a large layer of adventitia here as well. There's going to be a little bit of muscle in there, and there are no valves in this part of the circulatory system. All right, so in total then, when we think about where is the blood in that system, right? If we think about the circulatory system as a pump with pipes, where is most of the blood located? And it turns out that most of it is located in the veins. And that's partly because of the way the veins are made. They don't have quite as thick of a muscle layer. They've got more connective tissue, so they can kind of expand more. They're not as stiff as arteries are because they have less muscle. And so they're able to expand and stretch and hold excess fluid. And so what we say is that veins become a volume reservoir, meaning they're able to hold excess volume. If you think of a water reservoir, it's where we put excess water in case we need it someday, in case we run out, then we can take water from the reservoir, right? So your veins act as a fluid reservoir for your body, for your circulatory system. The arteries, on the other hand, they only have, you can see here, a relatively small proportion of the volume of the blood, but the arteries act as a pressure reservoir. And I was discussing that earlier when I said, especially those elastic arteries, they kind of absorb the pressure from ventricular contraction during systole, and then during diastole, they kind of return to their original position, and that kind of releases that pressure or that energy onto the system and helps to keep the blood pumping through the body even when the ventricles are relaxing. So arteries become the pressure reservoir. So you can remember veins are a volume reservoir and arteries are the pressure reservoir. You can see that there's a little bit of blood in the pulmonary circuit. There's a little bit of blood in the veins. We're going to see the rest is going to be, there's a little bit in the heart. Only 7% of your blood is actually in your heart at any one time. 13% here in the arterial system. So you can see a large amount of it is there in the veins. So let's look just briefly at the pulmonary circuit that we could call. Remember, that's the right side of the heart, that's the right ventricle pumping into the pulmonary arteries, then circulating through the lungs, coming back through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. That's the pulmonary circuit. So remember that it's deoxygenated blood that's leaving the right ventricle, that it goes into the pulmonary artery, or sometimes we call that the pulmonary trunk, because the pulmonary trunk divides into right and left pulmonary arteries to go to the right lung and to go to the left lung. There in the lungs, you're going to have the transfer of gases, so you're going to get rid of carbon dioxide that was picked up in the tissues as a waste product of cellular metabolism, and you're going to pick up oxygen that was breathed in from the air around you. So then that freshly oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart through the pulmonary veins and the left atrium. The systemic side of the circulation is a bit more complicated, and this is where we're really going to spend most of our time, and you're going to have to learn several of these arteries. Remember that that's the left side, what we call the systemic circulation. So think of it being systemic, meaning whole body wide minus that pulmonary circuit. So it's basically the rest of your body. So we're talking about everything from the head down to the feet. And so that's going to be all of the oxygenated blood that leaves the left ventricle through the aorta. So the aorta is the first location for that blood. And the aorta is then going to kind of direct traffic either up towards the head and arms or down towards the abdomen and legs. So as the blood comes up, let's see if we have a little bit better. As the blood comes out of the heart, it's going to go up through the ascending aorta. So the first part of the aorta kind of looks like this. It kind of comes up, has a little bit of a bend, and then goes down. So we're talking about kind of that there. So the first part of the aorta we call the ascending aorta. And the very first branches that come off that are the coronary arteries, as we mentioned before. Remember, those are the first, they kind of get first dibs on that fresh blood that comes out, and then that goes back to feed the heart itself. Then we call this part the aortic arch. So that's the arch. And off of the arch, we're going to get the branches that supply the chest, the neck, the head, and the upper extremities. So coming off the trunk, you have brachiocephalic trunk here on the right. On the left, you have the common carotid coming up to the head, and the left subclavian coming off to the arm. On the right, off of the brachiocephalic trunk, you have a right common carotid that comes off of that, as well as a right subclavian that comes off of that. So all of those branches kind of come off the arch of the aorta. We'll see some pictures here in a minute of those specific arteries. And then the descending part, the part that goes all the way down, actually all the way down into your abdomen, almost to your pelvis, that's the descending aorta. And that's going to send off branches that feed the abdomen, the pelvis, and your lower extremities. Picture of the aorta. There we go. Wow. All right, so if we look a little bit closer here, we'll see the ascending aorta and its branches and the arch. So the ascending aorta is this first part, and it's sending off those right and left coronary arteries that we talked about in the heart lecture. Let's see, there we go. Then the arch is going to be this curved part here, and there's basically three branches that come off of the aortic arch. On the right, you have kind of one combo branch. So when it comes off, we call it the brachiocephalic trunk. Remember, brachio means arm, cephalic means head. So it's telling you it's the trunk that's going to split into the supply to the head and the supply to the upper extremity. So that's that first part. It's going to then split into the right common carotid, and that's going to go up and feed the face and head and neck, and the right subclavian, which is going to feed the upper extremity and part of the chest. All right, so one brachiocephalic trunk turns into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Now, on the left side, we don't have a brachiocephalic trunk. We just split directly into the left common carotid here, and that's going to go up and feed the head and neck on the left side. And we have a left subclavian artery that's going to feed part of the chest and the arm on the left side. Okay, so eventually we end up with some symmetry where we have a right and left subclavian, we have a right and left common carotid, a right and left internal carotid and external carotid, but they just start out a little bit different. On the right side, it starts out as a brachiocephalic trunk, and then it splits. Just make sure we got everything there. Yeah, good. Okay, so now we're going to look at, this would be what we call an arteriogram. This is, we don't do this much anymore because we have sophisticated imaging with MRI and even CT, where we can give you a dye and we're able to look at your blood vessels pretty well. But this is how we used to do it before, and this is how we still do it if we're in the middle of a procedure and we need to see exactly where we are. So basically we put some dye in directly into your blood vessel, and then we can watch that dye fill up the blood vessels. So here is the aortic arch you might recognize. So the ascending aorta would be here, the descending aorta would be here, and you can see we've got these basically three trunks, right? The first one to come off is going to be the right brachiocephalic. Well, you don't even have to say right because there's only one brachiocephalic trunk. That brachiocephalic trunk eventually turns into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. Okay, the next branch that comes off of the arch of the aorta is the left common carotid, and the third branch that comes off is the left subclavian artery. So nothing different there, but I think it's a nice way of seeing it, and these pictures will be available in the lab as well. All right, so from the aorta, and from that that arch of the aorta, really, we're going to get all of the circulation is going to branch off of that. That's going to supply the head, the neck. That includes the brain, as well as the arm, the shoulder, the chest. That's all coming off of those three branches that come off of the aortic arch. And we're going to go through this a little bit in lab, but you should kind of think of it as a branching tree, right? So you start with the aorta, and the aorta is going to have three branches, right? You're going to have brachiocephalic, and you're going to have left carotid, and you're going to have left subclavian, right? But then each of those branches off. So the brachiocephalic trunk branches off into two. That's the right carotid and the right subclavian. But then they're going to branch off more. The right carotid is going to branch off into the internal and the external carotid, and so on and so forth. And each of those are going to continue to branch. So I want you to think of the circulation as kind of a branching tree, and we're going to spend some time in lab later in the week going through those branches, and I hope that that's going to help you remember which arteries are in which location. So you can come back to this picture, and it's going to kind of help you as you build your tree. The other nice thing about this picture is that it shows you kind of where the arteries are, but it also lets you know what parts of the body they supply. So I'm going to leave this here for you to look at, and we will build a tree together when we get into class, into lab later in the week. All right, as we've done before, you've seen this picture before. You're going to have to be able to recognize and localize arteries in the neck, in the shoulder, in the arm, on cadaver photos as well. So we were talking about the right subclavian. That's going to be the largest tube that you see here. That's how you know that that's the subclavian. It's the largest anything that you see there. And so then if you look at that subclavian, you can say, well, what is coming off of the subclavian? Well, there is a brachial artery that's coming off here, and there's another deep brachial artery. You're not going to have to learn that one. But basically, the brachial artery comes off of the subclavian. The axillary artery comes off of the subclavian as well. And then the brachial artery is going to supply much of the arm, especially that upper arm, before it splits into radial and ulnar arteries. I'm not making you learn subscapular artery, so don't worry about that one. As we come down the arm, we start with that brachial artery, as I mentioned, and then that brachial artery is going to branch into an ulnar artery. You see down here, it kind of goes posterior, so you're not going to be able to see it wrapping around there. And then the radial artery, which stays anterior, you can see all the way down. And the way you'll know is the radial artery is anterior and it's on the thumb side, right? The ulnar artery is going to run posterior and it's going to be on the pinky side, so that should be easy to remember. So subclavian goes to axillary and brachial artery, and brachial artery branches into radial and ulnar. All right, let's look at the circulation going to the head and neck and into the brain. So if we look at the right side, we'll start with that brachiocephalic trunk, but that quickly divides into the subclavian, which we just followed, and the common carotid, which is what we're going to follow now. So that common carotid is going to supply, 3/4 of the circulation. We're going to talk about some posterior circulation afterward, but most of the face, neck, brain is coming off of the carotid artery. So that carotid artery is going to branch into an external carotid that's going to feed the face and the neck and the scalp, and it's going to break off into a internal carotid that's going to go up and feed the brain. And we'll see those here in a minute. Right at that branch, right where the internal and external carotid branch off, there's something called the carotid sinus. And this is going to become very important in physiology because we're going to talk about there are some special sensors there that help regulate blood pressure and heart rate. And so that's an important anatomical structure to be able to identify now in anatomy that's going to make more functional sense when you get to physiology. So I do want you to learn that carotid sinus and that it's really at the bifurcation of the external and internal carotid. Two pictures. Notice coming off of the subclavian artery is this vertebral artery. That vertebral artery, of course, does feed the spine and the surrounding tissues, but it's going to go and actually feed the posterior part of the brain. Okay, so we're going to call that the posterior circulation of the brain. So here are some pictures. Again, you can see the brachiocephalic trunk is this first part, and then that's going to separate into the internal carotid going up and the subclavian going over to the arm. And then eventually that common carotid artery is going to split into an external carotid, which will go and supply the face, and an internal carotid, which will go and supply the brain, and that carotid sinus is going to be pretty much at that bifurcation. Just, we're not talking about veins right now, but notice you also have brachiocephalic vein, and then you have a subclavian vein, and so it's pretty much going to follow the arterial circulation. All right, so I mentioned the external carotid is going to go and kind of supply the face and the scalp and the skin with blood supply, and the internal carotid is going to go up into the brain through the skull, through some of those holes in the bottom of the skull, and it's going to enter the brain so that it can feed the actual brain tissue. So if you see here, we're going to start with the internal carotid here and here, and from that we're going to branch off into several different arteries that are going to feed the brain. So the two that I'm going to have you really focus on are the anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral, which are hard to see on this view. We're going to see them better on views that are coming up. But the anterior cerebral, the middle cerebral, and the posterior cerebral, which is going to come off of a different circulation that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, but the carotids are going to come and feed basically about 2/3 to 3/4 of the brain through the anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral arteries. Okay, but there's another source of circulation in the brain. Let's go back. Is going to come from the vertebral artery. Let's see if this picture shows. Yeah, so you've got a right and left vertebral artery, and those are going to come and join together at something called the basilar artery. So you do need to learn vertebral artery, you need to learn the basilar artery. There's only one basilar artery, so most of the arteries we're talking about, there's two of them, right? There's two internal carotids, there's a right and left. There's two subclavians, there's a right and a left. The basilar is more like the aorta, there's only one of them. So the two vertebral arteries come together and form the basilar. And then the basilar artery is going to form that posterior cerebral artery that I had mentioned. It's going to branch off of that, and that's going to feed the posterior part of the brain. Okay, so we're looking at the bottom of the brain here just to kind of see how the circulation enters the brain. But we're going to take a look at another view of the brain. Here is like a lateral view of the brain, and we're going to be able to see this circulation better. So as the blood comes up through the internal carotid and enters through the skull and into the brain, it branches into the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. So that anterior cerebral artery is going to feed that frontal lobe of the brain, and the middle cerebral artery is going to feed some of the temporal, pretty much all of the parietal, and maybe just a tiny bit of the occipital is going to be from that middle cerebral artery. This is another arteriogram. Okay, if we did a lateral view of the posterior circulation, we would want to follow the vertebral artery. So as it comes up, the vertebral artery comes up, and the two vertebral arteries will form the basilar artery, which is here, and then the basilar artery will branch into the posterior cerebral artery, and that's going to supply basically the occipital lobe of the brain. All right, so I hope this doesn't sound too confusing. Right now, what we've learned is that the internal carotid eventually splits into anterior cerebral and middle cerebral, right? And then we learned that the vertebral artery joins with the other vertebral artery to form the basilar artery, and then the basilar artery branches off into right and left posterior cerebral arteries. So it really isn't that complicated if you can kind of keep it straight like that. So here's kind of an inferior view of that posterior circulation. You're seeing the vertebral arteries coming in, forming the basilar artery, and then getting those posterior cerebral arteries branching off of that. And you can forget about all the other little arteries. We're not going to learn the names of those ones if you just learn these main ones. So in the end, you get branches coming off of branches coming off of branches, and you have a very extensive network of, and this is just showing you the arterial network of blood supply to the brain. So we've looked at kind of the upper circulation, right? We looked at the shoulder, the arm, kind of skipped over the chest. I'm not making you learn really the arteries in the chest, and then we kind of went up to the head and neck. So now we're going to take a look at the descending aorta and its branches, and look at how it feeds the abdomen and the lower extremities. I am showing you this picture so that you can see that there are branches coming off of the descending aorta that feed multiple areas of the chest, ones that feed the bronchioles and areas around the lungs, the esophagus, the mediastinal, the pericardial. I'm not making you learn those, so we'll just kind of skip on to the abdomen. As you get through the diaphragm and the aorta becomes the abdominal aorta, we're going to have 3 or 4 major branches before we get to the end of the aorta that you need to learn, okay? So the first one is what we call the celiac trunk. And that's just a little nub of a artery that comes off of the aorta just at the level where the kidneys are starting to show. And then very quickly that celiac trunk branches into 3 separate arteries. It separates into a left gastric artery, a splenic artery, and a common hepatic artery. And we're going to see here in a minute what those arteries supply. But you want to know the celiac trunk is the first major branch off of the abdominal aorta, and that it then further divides into those 3 arteries. Okay, the next one down is going to be the superior mesenteric artery, and that's going to feed a lot of your bowel. We'll see here in a minute. Immediately following the superior mesenteric artery, you're going to get right and left renal arteries. Okay, so there's only one celiac trunk and there's only one superior mesenteric artery, but there are 2 renal arteries, a right and a left, and they're going to feed the kidneys. As we continue down the abdominal aorta, we get to our final trunk here, or our final branch off of the abdominal aorta, and there is one inferior mesenteric. So you have a superior mesenteric up here and an inferior mesenteric down here. And that's going to feed basically the rest of the bowel that the superior mesenteric artery did not feed. So eventually the aorta ends here and branches into 2 new arteries, which are called the common iliac arteries. There's a right common iliac and there's a left common iliac. And those iliacs will further divide, that we'll see here in a minute. So here's another arteriogram showing the blood in those blood vessels. And you can see the abdominal aorta begins here. The very first branch that comes off is that celiac trunk, and then that's going to divide into, we had the left gastric, we had the splenic, we had the hepatic coming off of there. Then you're going to have the superior mesenteric artery. You're going to have the right and left renal arteries coming off either side. And then you're going to have where they're not really showing you this one's not showing you the inferior mesenteric artery, but that would be the last one. It would come off somewhere around here. And then eventually it splits, of course, into the common iliac arteries. So make sure you can identify the major branches on a model like we have in the lab, on a picture like this, on a picture like I showed you previously. Make sure you can identify those. Here's another model just giving you the same structures that you can see. We do have a couple of models, maybe 2 or 3 models in the lab that will show these blood vessels, so you can look further when we get into class. All right, so what organs, what parts of the abdomen do these arteries supply? So I mentioned that celiac trunk divides into left gastric, common hepatic, and splenic, so let's look at each of those. Common hepatic means liver, so that should be no surprise, but it also supplies the stomach, the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, the gallbladder, which goes along with the liver, so that's not surprising, and the pancreas. So that common hepatic has quite a bit of blood supply that it shares. Okay, the left gastric. Gastric stands for stomach, so that should be no surprise. The splenic is going to supply the spleen. Again, no surprise, but it also supplies the left side of the pancreas. Okay, as we get down to the superior mesenteric, I mentioned that that's going to supply most of your bowel. So it's going to get the part of the duodenum that the common hepatic didn't reach. It's going to get the rest of the pancreas. It's going to get most of the colon and pretty much all of the small intestines. So if you have a clot in your superior mesenteric, you're basically going to kill your small intestine, your bowel. Okay, the inferior mesenteric is going to pick up the rest, the left side of the colon and the rectum. That's kind of this part here. That's the leftovers. That brings us to kind of the final part of the arterial circulation, which would be lower limb circulation. So remember, we went from aorta to common iliac, so we're going to pick up here at the common iliac. That common iliac is going to divide into an internal and an external iliac, just like the external and internal carotid. The internal iliac is going to go posterior and provide circulation posteriorly, and we're not really going to follow that anymore from this point on. The external iliac, however, once it crosses the inguinal ligament here, is going to become the common femoral, we'll just call it the femoral artery. But the femoral artery is going to branch as well. It's going to give off a deep branch, which we're not really going to follow. And it's going to continue to supply blood down through the leg. So we went from common iliac to external and internal iliac. If we follow the external iliac, it becomes the femoral artery. Then we're going to follow the femoral artery and see how it becomes the popliteal artery and the posterior tibial, anterior tibial, and the fibular. And we'll see that better on the next page. Eventually, that same line, that same tree, ends on the foot in an artery called the dorsalis pedis, which eventually gives circulation to the top of the foot. All right, so let's follow this femoral artery. So from the external iliac, it turns into the femoral artery. You get that deep femoral artery branch that we're not really going to be too worried about. But we'll keep following the femoral part. So the femoral part, if we kind of come over to this picture on this side, will eventually become the popliteal artery. And we're going to ignore this descending genicular artery, and we're going to follow the popliteal down to where it branches. So the popliteal, remember popliteus and popliteal fossa, all of that was the back of the knee, right? So you should expect to see the popliteal artery running down the back of the knee. Once it leaves the knee, it's going to separate. It's going to branch again. So the first branch it's going to give off is this anterior tibial, which is going to then run anterior and supply the anterior part of the leg. And then it's going to also have a posterior tibial. So the popliteal branches into an anterior tibial and a posterior tibial. But that posterior tibial has one more branch to make. It's going to branch off. It's going to continue to be posterior tibial all the way down to the foot, but it's going to give off a branch that becomes the fibular artery and will supply blood to the outside of the lower leg. So we went external iliac to femoral to popliteal to anterior and posterior tibial, and then the posterior tibial branches off as well into the fibular. Some of these arteries are important because they give us kind of a measurement of the circulatory system, how well the heart is pumping, what your blood pressure might be. And so we do that by checking pulses. So in the upper arms, we like to check a pulse in the radial artery, for example, near the thumb, and most of you are used to seeing that. or you might check a pulse in the carotid up on the side of the neck, and you've probably seen people do that. The ones on the legs we haven't seen as much, but these are also important places to look for a pulse. So a femoral pulse, maybe you've seen somebody kind of checking a pulse in the groin. We do that on babies a lot because it's easy when we're changing a diaper. We can easily feel their femoral pulse. We also do this in a patient who has a very low blood pressure because it's a very large artery and it should have a good pressure in it. And so it's a place that you can try and feel a pulse when you might not be able to feel it elsewhere. But besides the femoral artery, there are a few other arteries where we can feel a pulse. So you can actually check a popliteal artery. That's hard to do with your fingers, but you can if the patient is thin, or otherwise you could use a Doppler machine to find that pulse. So that would be in the back of the knee. Then you can do a posterior tibial pulse. You're going to find that right near the medial malleolus. So typically we're going to be checking right there. You see how that artery comes very close to the surface, right just kind of behind the medial malleolus and a little bit inferior. That's where we're going to try and feel the posterior tibial pulse. And then lastly, we're going to check for a dorsalis pedis pulse. Now, this picture kind of shows the dorsalis pedis up here by the ankle, but you notice it gives off all of these branches here. So what we typically do is we place our fingers here on the top of the foot, and we try to see if we can feel a pulse there, and that would be the dorsalis pedis pulse. So there are 4 pulses that you can feel in the lower extremities. Okay, venous supply, I'm going to actually stop this lecture here, and I will reload these slides to another lecture, just so this one doesn't get too long. So this here will end the arterial portion, and I'll put up a separate lecture. It will be much shorter than this, just talking about venous supply.